My name is Wright. I am the voice of reason. I speak for the Last Crusade.
Let us now address the question of how to undo the corruption of the academy. Under this heading, we include the universities, the public school institutions, the scholarly and the scientific world. Of the several battles in the Last Crusade, this is the least difficult to accomplish and the most difficult to wage. It is the least difficult to accomplish once a sufficiently devoted majority convinces the public consensus that the current political, economic, and cultural institutions supporting the educational establishment have achieved the direct opposite of their intended result, namely, the result of educating the young. It is difficult to wage because nothing directly can be done other than to bring public attention and alumni influence to bear on the problem. In the case of grammar school, the institution is supported by government fiat and taxpayer funds. No boycott is possible. The academy can only be reformed once political institutions are reformed. Higher education receives grants from the government and from large private philanthropic organizations or trusts. And their primary mission is to corrupt and control scholarly opinion and scientifically research to support current politically convenient frauds and fairy tales, and to control the course of the scientific dialogue so that certain topics are never discussed and certain research never investigated. The academy can only be reformed once the donor class is reformed. Moreover, the bias of the business world makes college degrees necessary even for entry-level positions, and this bias continues by inertia long after the original virtue that granted prestige to college graduates has evaporated or been inverted. This grants the brainwashers the false prestige and stolen valor of real scholars and educators, a creature as extinct in the modern day as the honest newspaperman. And this grants unscientific frauds, political activists, and echo-panic hustling charlatans the lab-coated vestments and aura of infallibility that science worshippers routinely bestow upon science. The academy can only be reformed once the consensus of opinion, both among employers and among the general public, about academics in general and scientists in particular, has been reformed. Hence, in this discussion, the discussion of reforming the morals and manners of the people, of the business world, and of the political world would be repetitive. Each man in the Last Crusade must select the battle to which he is called as his vocation. Those called to enter the academic world and enter the lists against the forces of hell and darkness must resign themselves to fruitless decades or even generations of conflict before victory heaves into view. The political reformation of the current corrupt and overly bloated system will consist solely of starving the gluttons. Academics do no work, and so they should not eat our tax dollars. The academics spread a plague through the minds of the young, and they have successfully produced a generation of craven, foolish, hysterical, and sadistic hecklers, know-nothings, arsonists, and yobs. This discussion need go into no detail as to what need be done. Break the teachers' unions, jail their leaders, privatize the skill system, abolish public universities, rescind so-called women's liberation so that mothers can be liberated once again to go do their real jobs of educating their children. Then burn the Federal Department of Education, hang its administrators, and pass a constitutional amendment that Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of an academy, nor the free exercise thereof. I am kidding about hanging the malefactors, of course. The traditional penalty for heretics who commit treason of scholarship was burning at the stake. One hopes we need not reach this stage. The discussion here and now will remark only on what might convince the consensus of the general public, and will identify the main obstacle to such conviction. To convince the consensus, we need only do what was done to us: infiltrate the commanding high ground of the press and the entertainment industry, slowly replace the academics as they retire. We need to combine against enemy worldviews, philosophies, cults, and ideologues, to explode the bad theories, and to expose to public view the insolent wickedness reigning among intellectuals. No honest man in his right mind would entertain the ideologies of envy, unreason, hysteria, hatred, or death, or grant them more attention than the brief time needed to see their hypocrisy and absurdity, were these ideas not disguised as their own opposites. The strategic goal of enemy activity from the beginning has been to create a generation of dishonest men. By having educators teach blatant self-contradictions as truths, that it is unlawful, dangerous, and shameful to question, the teacher encourages a narcissistic and neurotic behavior. Namely, the student takes the ideas he is being taught to be a precious and central part of his own identity. And the result is that any skeptical examination of the merit of any of the ideas of that identity becomes miscast to him as a vicious personal attack. Therefore, the neurotic student loses the ability to distinguish between the fashionable yet superficial ideas infecting and stupefying his thought process and his own soul, his own self-image, his own self-esteem. The tremendous advantage we have over the enemy is that we can work openly, since our ideas both make sense and rest on truth, whereas they must work entirely by stealth and misdirection, hiding their true purposes, ignoring evidence, and avoiding logic. We need only to convince those with eyes to see that the educators cannot educate, the scientists cannot investigate, the scholars cannot reason, under the current system of conformist academic opinion. Once any institution makes social justice its primary aim, it loses its ability to carry out its core function. Academic institutions are no exception. We need only convince those with eyes to see that teachers cannot teach. In a healthy society, educating the young was the province of mothers who read to their children from the Bible, and education included both morals and book learning. Private teachers and tutors, hired by townships, taught the basics of reading, writing, ciphering, and figuring. For those who did not go into apprentice work to learn a trade, scholarly work was a private matter. The medieval system of universities, of gathered colleges, was usually founded and staffed by holy men, and it sufficed to produce the greatest civilization history ever recorded or imagination can conceive. In a healthy school, an educated youth learns how to think for himself, to use skepticism to question his assumption, and to use reason to answer those questions. An educated man knows how little he knows, and how the deep questions of life have honest answers on both sides, so that any answer, in good faith, can be reopened for questioning. But a youth sent through a modern college is indoctrinated, if not brainwashed, to support a number of self-contradictory absurdities. He is conditioned to react to skepticism as if harboring doubt is an act of disloyalty, a moral lapse, and a madness. An indoctrinated man is a zombie. An educated man is a free man. An indoctrinated man believes that truth is settled, obvious, and indisputable, because truth rests not on reasoning process, but on the authority of anonymous experts. An indoctrinated man is conditioned to treat questions as personal attacks, and to act as if no good faith disagreement can or does exist. For him, to question the authority of received opinion is not merely treason, it is blasphemy and a sign of mental illness. This is why the conclusions that males cannot mate with males, which to the unbrainwashed man is a self-evident biological truth, is regarded by the indoctrinated man as homophobia, that is, as a pathological fear and hatred of sodomites. To oppose socialism, likewise, is reaction, that is, a pathological and thoughtless fear of change, which irrationally operates against one's own class interests. Hence, the student who goes to college is brainwashed into becoming less educated, less able to think for himself than when he came. What little wisdom he has is taken away, and he is taught foolishness in its place. This is the mere opposite of education. The enormity, as well as the enormousness, of the fraud perpetrated by the academic world cannot be overstated. Academics receive floods of funding from alumni, from the donor class, and from the state. Academics receive prestige greater than that ever given the holiest of priesthoods. Those who persist are granted tenure, which renders them, like judges, immune from being held to account for poor performance. Meanwhile, all efforts at school choice, from vouchers to charter schools, are firmly resisted by public teachers' unions, who are firmly in control of the Democrat Party. Neither disciplining students nor expelling them is allowed under their policies. The children are therefore trained to fail, and to blame failure on some imaginary injustice, such as systematic racism or evil fairies. To ruin the educational prospects of their charges may not be a deliberate and satanic policy, but if it is not deliberate, no one can explain why it just so happens to be the sole and unvarying outcome at which all these policies aim. We have fed into the glutton mouth of Moloch an endless supply of money and the minds and souls of 3 generations of children or more. What has been the result? In return for our support and treasure fed into the gluttonous mouth of the Academy, this is our payback. The scientist has produced an endless supply of junk science. The academician has filled once distinguished academic journals with nonsense indistinguishable from randomly computer-generated jabberwocky. And the scholar has degraded the ability even of practical or results-oriented disciplines like engineering or mathematics to function. The researcher has willingly bankrupted the hard-won prestige of his profession by upholding and promoting an endless series of ecological hoaxes and frauds meant only to inflate the power of Caesar without aiding the environment. And the professor is busily destroying knowledge and crippling minds and beckoning on the Dark Ages. The purpose of liberal education is to fit a young man to be able to carry out his responsibilities as a free citizen, that is, to be rational and virtuous enough to shoulder the burdens of living as a free man. This consists of 3 interconnected parts. First, it consists of learning moral virtue from the example of heroes and saints among the lordly and noble dead whose sacrifice formed our civilization. Second, to learn from the example of men of letters, philosophers, sages, doctors, jurists, and scientists, the fine art of reasoning, of discussion, and of debate, so that a student will be able to be fit to discuss the great issues of the day with his peers, or in other words, to learn not what to think, but how to think. Third, to learn enough of the arts, literature, history, and civics to love our faith, love our civilization, our laws and customs, to love our native land, starting with our local community and home. Or, in other words, to learn what we have inherited, learn why it must be preserved, and, when possible, improved, and how to defend this legacy from attack, and pass it intact onto the next generation. To the contrary, the modern student is tempted and lured to fall into the abyss of intellectual pride, in whose void no questioning of the conformist opinion is possible or desirable, and the art of debate and discussion are outlawed as immoral. The modern student is taught that it is always a sin to question dogma, never an honest mistake, nor an honest attempt to clarify confusion. For example, when Professor Wormtongue, educated and conditioned by the enemy educational methods, and speaking for the enemy, says no truth is absolute, even a schoolboy would naturally ask whether the statement is true under all conditions, that is, whether it itself is an absolute. When Professor Wormtongue says all human reasoning is in vain, even a schoolboy can ask by what reasoning such a conclusion was reached. When Professor Wormtongue says reality is a matter of personal preference, even a schoolboy can ask by what standard are those who say that reality is real to be condemned for holding an unreal belief. When Professor Wormtongue says morality is situational, even a schoolboy would wonder whether the situation of lying to a schoolboy about the nature of morality is one of those situations where dishonesty is permitted. When the professor says beauty is in the eye of the beholder, even a schoolboy knows how ugly such a statement is to look upon. When Professor Wormtongue says man is merely one beast among many, no different from any other, even a schoolboy who asks a new tapir or sloth to confirm the testimony will hear no answer. When Professor Wormtongue says a man has no rights in the singular but only as a collective, even a schoolboy can ask into what group the wormtongue by birth was placed to give him the right to say so. When Professor Wormtongue says the fruits of all labor of men ought to be redistributed as Caesar decrees, even a schoolboy can see this makes all men into beasts of burden, with no right to speak on any topic, including this one. When Professor Wormtongue says God is dead, the wormtongue is merely confessing that the divine spark called conscience inside him is what he wishes would fall silent and die. Even a schoolboy sees as much. No one can argue in favor of such absurdities, because they argue against themselves. Merely to name them is clearly to refute them. So the task of the professor is to see that this clarity never comes about. So there is naught else the poor professor can do except to break the spirit of the helpless young man placed in his merciless claws, to erode the student's integrity, darken his mind, and warp his sense of right and wrong so far out of alignment that the student dare never ask any such questions, no matter how obvious. Not ask them in public, not in private, not even when alone. A student warned about this trick may indeed emerge unscathed and unconvinced, but such resolve is rare. These techniques are potent. These techniques have been studied diligently and scientifically for many years by everyone from Nazi propagandists to Madison Avenue ad executives. The psychology involved, when reduced to its simplest, is this. All one need do is convince a man that virtue consists of winning the applause of others, and wisdom consists of agreement with the conformity. That is all. Skepticism becomes a sign of doubt, which is treason. Self-esteem becomes something to be won by flaunting an imaginary, unearned virtue via symbolic, public displays of loyalty to the groupthink, and by endless, insincere denunciations of all nonconformists as subhuman, if not as dangerous enemies. To question makes the modern student feel unsafe. To think is a sign of danger, and she must retreat to her safe space, armed with coloring books and comfort animals until she recovers. To cut off the student from all other sources of support is the psychology that cultists rely on to baffle and indoctrinate their unwary yet willing victims. To convince the student to take some irredeemable public step is the psychology criminal gangs use to ensure loyalty. To flatter the ego with illusionary victories is the psychology of narcissism. To dismiss reason amid screams and shrieks that emergency makes discussion impossible is the psychology of mass hysteria. To accuse and to believe all accusations, no matter how absurd, is the tactic of a witch hunter. All this and more is what the student in a modern educational establishment is conditioned to accept when he adopts political correctness and social justice jihadism. Let us consider the old saying that Republicans think Democrats are imprudent, whereas Democrats think Republicans are evil. If the saying is true, then Republicans are pragmatists and Democrats are ideologues. To the pragmatist, political struggles are matters of practicality. Politics to them is the art of the possible. Compromise is feasible because in life certain trade-offs may be costly in the short term while beneficial in the long term, and half a loaf is better than no bread. But to the ideologue, the struggle is between angels and devils, with no compromise possible, no gray areas, and certainly no trade-offs. Compromise is not feasible because there can be no compromise between absolute good and absolute evil. One often wonders why Republicans, when finding extremist or racist crackpot figures in their midst, act immediately and vocally to denounce and expel such creatures, whereas Democrats never do. Again, for the pragmatist, an extremist can be judged on how much good he does versus how much damage he does to the reputation of your party. Anything below that threshold can be tolerated, but 1 inch beyond the threshold, the denunciation will be rapid and sure. This is why Republicans can be big tent and welcome those who disagree on many points of a platform, as long as they agree with the basics. But it's also why racists and neo-Nazis and alt-right, and all others who call themselves right-wing but are actually leftists in thought, word, and deed, are promptly and utterly renounced. Contrariwise, for the ideologue, the focus is not on the practical art of how to govern the nation, nor how to decide deep questions of economy and wealth, treaty and war, law, justice, nor the morals and manners of the people. None of this, which is the whole body of politics to the pragmatist, is politics to the ideologue. There is no extreme wing in the ideologue's party because extremism in the cause of absolute goodness is no vice. That is why the middle-of-the-road socialist has no argument to give against the communist and no principle to stand on when the communist turns violent. The middle-of-the-road socialist cannot say that the violent means employed by the extreme communist are impractical, for that would make him a pragmatist and destroy his own position. Nor can he call the violence immoral, since he doesn't believe in morality. He only believes in the superficial appearance of morality. The sole focus for the ideologue is virtue signaling, that is, the self-absorbed spread of the peacock tail of his own vanity, seeking public applause for some strength of character he does not possess, to get a reward he did not earn. The ideologue wishes to seem wise without being wise. He wishes to don the martyr's halo without suffering the death, wound, inconvenience, or criticism of a martyr. He wishes to grasp the palm of sainthood while whoring around. And he wishes to adorn himself with the laurels of heroism while being a mean, small, nasty, and despicable coward. Hence, the ideologue need not read laws before passing them, nor examine a candidate's views before voting for him, nor announce programs before enacting them. More to the point, the ideologue need never consider the results of his allegedly well-intentioned policies and laws. For to be concerned with results is a pragmatist concern. The ideologue is only concerned with appearances, with shallow appearances. He is only concerned with the fashion of the moment. Moreover, the ideologue has no self-awareness, no sense of irony when he steps into hypocrisy, no ability to examine his own actions objectively. This is because, in the false world of his own vain imaginings, he is a pristine and superlative angel in a war with perfect devils. He is always perfectly good, and all who lack perfect enthusiasm for him are perfectly evil. A pragmatic man, seeing something that does not work, is willing to reverse course and try a different approach. He weighs costs and benefits. He seeks expert opinion. He heeds the wisdom of elders. But he always makes his own decisions on his own terms in the end, because collective decisions, ruled by committee and groupthink, are logical impossibilities as well as impractical follies. A pragmatist is willing to admit he has been impractical when he sees his efforts overrun their costs or fail altogether. But an ideologue can never admit that he was evil. To call himself a sinner, even in the smallest thing, or even on an unrelated topic, would shatter his vainglory. An ideologue cannot compromise with what he considers to be an absolute evil. He can only win concessions and wait for an opportunity to strike again. And likewise, an ideologue dare not admit, there can be two sides to any issue. For him, all cases are closed. All scientific questions are settled. All truth is pellucid, simple, and obvious. One need never give audience to the devil's advocate because he is of the devil. Even to listen for a moment to a witch is to call down the wrath of the witch hunters onto oneself. One of the more strange and neurotic side effects of the ideologue psychology is the unwillingness and inability to recognize or admit any virtue, any skill, or any admirable characteristics of any kind can exist in the person of someone accused of wrongthink by the witch hunters. We have seen this carried out to an absurd degree in the political sphere, but it also happens in the arts and sciences. As when a scientist who can land a spaceship on a speeding comet, or an award-winning artist, once accused of thought crime, becomes double plus ungood, and nothing he does or did can be complimented or even tolerated. Everything he does must be condemned, and absolutely. Any witch hunter who violates this principle, let us say, for example, J.K. Rowling, no matter if, until then, she had been the most effective and loyal advocate promoting the ideology of the ideologues, such as by using her superhuman levels of prestige in the cause of normalizing disgusting sexual perversions to children, she immediately becomes prey to being hunted as a witch herself, if she steps over the line. Because a pragmatist waits for evidence and hears from both prosecution and defense before rendering a verdict, and counts the cost before erecting a tower, he can suspend judgment. He does not know what is not practical before evidence is in. To him, there's no shame of speaking what is unknown to him, or where his experience and his wisdom falls short. But to the ideologue, goodness is obvious, and rests always on the surface. One can judge the content of a man's character simply and easily, since it is caused by the color of his skin. To wait for evidence would be like hesitating in the choice between the angelic and the devilish. The case is closed. The mind is closed. Finally, when the whole world of ideologues, as if with one accord, bend their every effort to plunging off the cliff of disasters that follow from the godlessness, the socialism, collectivism, irrationalism, totalitarianism, violence, ruin, and anarchy, they cannot stop, they cannot hesitate, they cannot slow their mad, headlong rush into the abyss. Indeed, when the brink of doom looms right before their eyes, they must damn their eyes and redouble their efforts. Why? Because moderation, when the question is a war between perfect angels and perfect devils, aids the devils. Compromise is impossible. Hesitation is unthinkable. Thought, reflection, and sobriety are impermissible. In such a war, of course, the ends justify the means. The communist kills 100 million people in the 20th century alone. In return for the most massive human sacrifice in all history, he achieves nothing whatsoever. What can make otherwise normal and decent men into such bloodthirsty fanatics? Ideology. The conviction that perfection is easy and superficial, and that all opposition is in bad faith, comes from one place: ideology. That is why the student in the modern school, instead of learning the arts of rhetoric and the disciplines of logic, learns only one conditioned Pavlovian response to any attempt at discussion or cross-examination. The question is dismissed before it is answered on the grounds that it was asked in bad faith. Because only devils and deplorable wretches, paragons of ignorance and evil, would ever dare doubt the perfection of the self-anointed moral elite. This is the pith, if not the whole, of what modern education consists. The academy strips away the student's capacity for independent thought, teaching postmodern methods of misinterpreting literature, which in turn silences all the eons of human learning past. The student learns to hate reading, and to dismiss thinking, and to regard ratiocination as mere vocalizations of bigotry and bias. As I said, to reform the academy is the easiest of all battles to fight, because we need only speak an obvious truth that becomes more and more obvious day by day. It is the hardest battle to win, because the entire institutional structure of politics, of the plutocracy, and of the public education is meant to immunize these frauds, professors, indoctrinators, crackpots, and hoaxmongers from any repercussions of their unparalleled malfeasance. Shall we reform the academy? We must begin with ourselves in prayer and fasting.